morning and welcome back to NPTEL online certification course on Indian poetry in English. Till now you have been listening to the lectures on poets who started writing or who practiced their hand in pre-independent India. The last lecture that you listened on Sarojini Naidu actually was a sort of eye opener that one cannot be confined or kept under control for a long time. Even women poets also tried to sow through their poetic initiatives and through their poetic overs. In this regard, one thing that is quite important to note here is that after we got independence, there were so many things that came and that brought a sort of change. And so was it in the world of Indian poetry in English as well. Not only at the level of India, but around the world also, several developments took place. The two world wars which had already been fought and were over could have a catastrophic effect on mankind. And then the poetic world also witnessed all these, and the poets tried to bring all these experiences into their own field of writing and their own ambit of writing. And that is why the lecture that we are going to start now, this lecture is going to be a bit changed from what we have learned earlier. Till now we could see that Indian poetry in English was a sort of imitative affair, but now we had our own air, we had our own government, we had our own system, we had our own writing, we had our own press, we had many people who had taken to journalism, many people who had taken to editing, many people who had taken to publishing. So, there were numerous opportunities waiting now, and that is why the socio-political conditions in India, were quite favorable even to poets. But the experiences that were there, because these poets who came to write independent India or after independence, they could have myriad experiences, the colonial period being over. Now, the hangovers of the colonial days could not haunt people. Now, they had a new thing and they had a new experience and they wanted to follow what was going on in the outside world, in the neighboring countries, and of course, this actually helped a great deal to the poets who came to write. In this regard, I mean, even in India also we could witness several incidents which we found that they were not pretty, rather very ugly experiences one could have, fine. And the poets, artists, writers, all these people were actually trying to locate not only their own identity, but the identity of their country as well. So, this affected the new poets also, or the early modern poets. So, today in this lecture we are going to start with one such modern poet who is Nissim Ezekiel. It is said that after India got independence, Indian poetry writing in English also felt a different sort of change, and there were many poets who got opportunities, as I told you earlier, because of some people who had started their own writers workshop, namely Purushottam Lal we have been talking about, who started along with some of his friends, Purushottam Lal, then Kamla Das, then Anita Desai and many others. They actually associated and they started publishing poems of the contemporary poets who were practicing their hands at writing poetry. So, the emergence of these new poets provided readers with new themes, new experiences. Now, they were not confined only to sing the traditional glory, the splendor of the past, or their poems were not soaked only in sentimentality. They were actually trying to have a new experience, and they were also being influenced by the poets who were writing either in England or in some other countries. So, the appearance of critical studies, that also helped. Many new journals came in India. Some of the journals, namely Illustrated Weekly of India, some of the poetry workshops, namely Writers Workshop, then Penn also started publishing many poets. So, international recognition of Commonwealth literature, that also added a new flavor to Indian poetry writing in English. It is said, actually in one of the editorials, P. Lal himself had said, the phase of Indo-Anglian romanticism. Now, my dear friends, till now one could say that it was an era of romanticism, because many of these poets who were writing, they were influenced, and they were influenced in a different manner, they were imitating. So, there was a tendency towards romanticism, but now, as P. Lal says, it ended with Sarojini Naidu. And so, the new poets who came, they had before them many new challenges. Here on the right hand side, you can find a book entitled 10-20th Century Indian Poetry, which is edited and compiled by R. Parthasarathi, who himself was a great poet. We will talk about him also as we proceed further. So, what happens when we talk about the new poets? No discussion can be complete without the introduction and without the discussion of Nissim Ezekiel. It is said that no Indian English poet could be as perfect when we talk about the modern Indian English poetry as Nissim Ezekiel. Now, let us also come to have some background information about Ezekiel. Ezekiel was actually born in 1924 in a Ben Israel family. Now see, this also has a story. So, he was actually a Jew, but then his family members, I mean his forefathers, had migrated to India, and he considered India to be his home. So, the question of identity that will come across in majority of his poems, that comes to haunt at times, and the poet also responds to it, because the new poetry is not a poetry of sentimentality, but it is actually a poetry of rationality. It is actually a poetry which talks about the new experience of new ages, the how the wind blows not only in India, but in outside world also. So, they were influenced. Now, Ezekiel's father was a professor of botany and zoology. Ezekiel actually had so many friends, majority of them were editors. One such was Ibrahim Al-Qaji, who actually told Ezekiel to visit England so that he could actually be educated properly. But Ezekiel did not have much money, and Al-Qaji paid the boat ticket for one side. And so, Ezekiel could go to England for some time, and then his first poem, and he had the experiences of becoming an editor. He had also been associated with several presses, and we have already talked about C.R. Mandi, who actually found in Ezekiel a sort of a spark. And there was a time when poets would flood to Ezekiel as poets would flood to Hopkins in England, and Ezekiel would actually advise them, because technically speaking, Ezekiel had that fineness of a poet, who he was actually perfect in terms of prosody, not only the traditional prosody, but also the free stanzas, and then the themes of her poems were also varied. There is a very famous book by Bruce King, which is entitled Modern Indian English Poetry, where Bruce King says that while others wrote poems, Ezekiel wrote poetry, and there are good many volumes by Ezekiel which we will come across. So, Ezekiel in the beginning was highly influenced by the radical views of M.N. Roy, and that is why he was a little bit active in terms of the political happenings, but then he could not continue for a long time, and he dedicated himself to poetry writing because he considered that poetry was a way of life, and he had to answer so many things through his poetry, and he cannot be considered to be a poet of the fixed category because he had ample experiences and different sort of experiences. Sometimes you can find Ezekiel talking between his own self and the other self. He sometimes is struggling with his own mind, and he actually wanted to say what he really wanted to say, because by poems he believed that it was not simply a philosophy, but it was also a sort of rationality, it was also a sort of experience which in everyday lives we come across. Now, Ezekiel also got the opportunity of editing Poetry India for a year 1966 to 67, and he came across many articles, reviews and translations which also sharpened his poetic sensibility. So, it is said that it was with Ezekiel, Nissim Ezekiel, that contemporary Indian English poetry evolved. Many of his poems were published in Illustrated Weekly. Then he also contributed to Thought, and then also to Literary Half Yearly, and he had a different notion about poetry. His philosophy of poetry was different. You can find the variety of poems that he has written. Ezekiel also got an opportunity to found another journal named Quest in 1955, which of course because of some unavoidable reasons came to be shut off. I mean, it could not continue, but then with it so many things came into picture. The free verse to traditional prosody, which was actually his own forte. He not only tried to bring musicality, but wherever he needed, he also started writing in free verses. And then the imageries that he brought in his own poetry, since he was a Jew. So, some of the imageries you will find from the Bible, then some from you will find from the everyday life experiences and all. So, Quest actually not only helped Nissim Ezekiel, but also helped Nissim Ezekiel and many of his associates like Dom Maras, then Adil Jashawala, then Arun Koladkar, and all these names which are also very famous will come across, then Darubala and all these people got the opportunity to write through these journals. Now, while we talk about Ezekiel's poetic corpus of the world of poetry, there are some of the volumes which are actually very important. The very first to come into force was A Time to Change, and this was actually this was published first outside, and then Writers Workshop also gave him so many opportunities when in 1953 he published 60 poems, and then he published the third, then The Unfinished Man, The Exact Name, Hymns in Darkness, and Latter Day Psalms. Now, if you have a look at the title of his poems, you will find that this poet is searching for his own identity, because he and you know about his own identity, he says that my background is where I belong to, isn't it? So, majority of his poems, they revolve around the poet's way of answering so many questions which other people could have raised. A Time to Change, now this is itself very symbolical, then 60 poems, then the third, and then comes The Unfinished Man. In Ezekiel's world, you will not only find poems which are actually modeled after what the new world is thinking about, but he is also answering certain challenges of sexuality, challenges of marriage, challenges of everyday, challenges which a common man also feels, challenges which a common man's identity at times when it is questioned, and then there are some which also talk about contemporary Indian culture. So, we'll when we come across some of his poems, we will find. So, in Time to Change, fine, and you know what is one of the greatest weapons of this poet, I mean Nissim Ezekiel, is that he is not only intellectually aware, but morally very intelligent. He will actually he is morally very intelligent, intelligent in the sense that majority of his poems have a sort of ironic tone. If we read some of the lines of some of the poems, we will find that there is a sort of ironic tone, and this ironic tone, this irony is served in such a manner. One poem all of you might be familiar with, The Night of the Scorpion, because it is prescribed not only at school level, but at college level, at sometimes in university level also. So, A Night of the Scorpion, which is a very common, it is a very common event. A lady is being stung by a scorpion, and then how people around her and even her own husband, how all of them have different versions, how some of them talk about tradition, some of them talk about superstition, and finally when it comes to the lady only says one thing, and she says, it was actually good that the scorpion left my children and bit me. So, when we come to see that, what a sort of irony, the lady is not concerned about her own pains, rather the lady is concerned about her own child's welfare. So, the Indian ethos that we are talking about, my dear friend. In many of the poems by Ezekiel, you will find that there is a personal story which has been served in such a manner, because there is a persona, and the persona's point of view is quite different. Let us take some lines from one very significant poem by Ezekiel entitled Enterprise. And in this poem, the poet actually talks about how when we start making an enterprise or a project, how we actually think, how different people have different notions, how you do not stand together, and finally when it comes to one's own, day by day we find people distancing, leaving your own company. And so the poet in a very ironic tone says, when finally we reached the place, we hardly know why we were there. The trip had darkened every face. Our deeds were neither great nor rare. Home is where we have to gather grace. My dear friends, through this poem, what actually he wants to say is that all of us must stay united. So, by saying this, he gives a different lesson. Now, every day or the other, we are involved in certain strife, certain dividedness, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally, sometimes religiously, sometimes on certain grounds, the grounds of caste, color, nationality, whatsoever. So, the poet actually tries to give a lesson, and then he says, home is. So, by home here he means peace, harmony, joy, integrity. So, home is where we have to gather grace. The poet at times also shows his disillusionment with certain traditional modes, with certain systems that are imposed upon us, because there is a new beginning, there is a new light which he comes to see from the outside. So, even though being an outsider, the poet, he actually feels the tinge and the pangs. And in one poem named Marriage, you will find a biting, a sharp attack is there. All of us want to be married, but then the poet actually what he says is, when we marry, we find that we are made for each other. So, there is a comment on it. If we read the lines, we will find there is a comment on it. And then what he says is that life is not simply something that is repetitive. And how he says, lovers when they marry face eternity with touching grace, complacent at being fated never to be separated. So, when you get married, you feel that you are bound forever. But my dear friend, you should be aware of the modern ways of life, the new modes of life. Life is changing fast. So, you cannot say that it is forever, it is not only for now, but forever. And then he says towards the end, the last stanza, the poet says that when we have had all sorts of experiences, all sorts of union, all sorts of intimacies, then perhaps we forget that the prime of fall is also there. Here he actually refers to the story of Adam and Eve, and then temptation, and then he talks about, then suddenly the mark of Cain began to show on her and me. Why should I reign the mystery by harping on the suffering rest, myself a frequent waiting guest? So, he says perhaps we forget that this situation is not forever. At any point of time anything may happen. So, life is not about simply taking the vows and understanding that this is going to be forever. So, through this poem Marriage also, he actually tries to give us a lesson, and then there is an irony that having said all the prayers and promises and all, no, what happens is towards the end we feel that this is only repetitive and then we must change. So, from time to change, and then life is full of choices. Now, here you can find that unlike the traditional poets, Ezekiel is completely different, and he says that in life anything may happen any moment. So, we must be ready to see and to face. It is not that we are made for each other. Now, what are actually the characteristic features of Ezekiel's world? Ezekiel was highly influenced by Austrian poet Rilke and the British poets Eliot and Auden, and you will find that how changes were taking place, how in Eliot also we could say April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead. And in one poem he also says, he also writes, I mean Nissim Ezekiel writes that when we come in April, how can we return home? I mean there is again an irony in it. So, in majority of his poems you can find a quest for physical, social and spiritual integration of the self, And you know, Ezekiel was not confined only to one style, rather he was also trying to bring some experiment in terms of language. And the experiment that you will find, the experiment is very beautiful, where like Sarojini Naidu was making use of Indian words frequently, but here also by making a sort of linguistic experience, what he tries to say is, because once upon a time he was said that, oh, you are writing poetry and in a very prosodic manner, but how come are you aware of how English is being spoken outside, or how English is being spoken by other people who do not have the knowledge of English? And on the basis of that he wrote a poem where he experimented. So, this experimentation with the language was also a sort of experimentation, it was a sort of rejection of all these traditional manners, that there should be a complete prosodic features and all that. So, in one of the poems entitled Very Indian Poem in English, what he says you will find, everything is coming. See, he actually makes us all aware of the impending reality. Everything is coming, regeneration, remuneration, contraception. So, the voice of modernity. Now, you are not confined to be together to one person tied for years with vows of marriage and all, but then there are several other changes taking place, and we have to adopt to those changes also. And then he says, and then he says towards the end he says, you are going. Now, you see structurally this is not English. Here there is actually a sort of breaking of rules of grammar. You are going, but you will visit again anytime, any day. Now, as we often say, this is just a sort of translation, no, anytime, any day. I am not believing in ceremony, always I am enjoying your company. So, now through this poem, and he titles this poem as Very Indian Poem in Indian English, Very Indian Poem in Indian English. So, this is actually the language of the common masses. And in Ezekiel's poem one can also find a profound sense of alienation as a poet who is always in exile. There are some poems on animals also. Ezekiel believed that poetry was a way of life, and we cannot keep ourselves confined, or we cannot keep ourselves sheltered always. We also have to open up to new possibilities, because the outside world, you cannot remain aloof. The outside world, the changing realities, and one must change oneself according to the changing realities. So, the marriage that you take vows with, is that marriage going to be permanent? And what he had said today, we can find a glimpse of it if we have a look at what is happening all around the world, my dear friends. He also expresses, in the words of Bruce King, he also expresses personal, intellectual, moral and religious concerns in contemporary voice without mystical diffusion and artificial diction. He does not go after artificial diction. I mean, by artificial diction I mean the rhyming, imposing rhyme he does not go after. If it is rhymed, it is okay, otherwise he can also take recourse to blank verses. The poet maintains a sort of distinct persona and a point of view, which we can find through his poems like Philosophy, through his poems like Enterprise, through his poems like there is one poem and not only entitled Marriage, but then there are other poems, To Love, like that. There are many such poems where you can find that in every poem the poet, and what is significant about him is the concluding lines provide you with a message. If you read any of the poems, the concluding lines are very powerful, because Ezekiel has a command over colloquial idiom. Technically, he is a poet who has perfected himself in the art of writing, and that is why many poets would often throng to him for correction. It is said that even Dom Morris used to go to him, but as when we compare the language of Dom Morris and Ezekiel's language was very simple. Of course, in majority of the poems you can find rhyme and rhythm as well. Night of the Scorpion, as I had been telling you, I would simply read some of the lines to tell you how a common experience is converted into a beautiful poem. Only when the scorpion came across, when the scorpion bit a lady, a mother, what were the reactions of the people who were surrounding? I remember the night my mother was stung by a scorpion. 10 hours of steady rain had driven him to crawl beneath a sack of rice. So, he very minutely delineates it, where the scorpion was, parting with his poison flash of diabolic tail in the dark room. He risked the rain again, and now the villagers came. The pigeons came like swarm of flies. So many people came, a very common incident, and so many people came. So, here on the one hand we find that how people all around, how they are very cooperative, but then we also find how a very little affair, a trifle is made very uncommon, and buzz the name of God 100 times to paralyze the evil one. So, superstition here with candles and with lanterns. And then the father, I mean the poet's father, who was actually irrational, so he thought that he will bring something that can actually burn. They searched for him, he was not found. They clicked their tongues with every movement that the scorpion made. His poison moved in mother's blood, they said. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth. You see the superstitious voice. May your suffering decrease the misfortunes of your next birth, they said. May the sum of evil balanced in this unreal world against the sum of good become diminished by your pain. Now, if we have a look at the entire poem, you can find that it is not only, the poem is not only set in a village and the surrounding where the people are of different faiths and beliefs, but the poet's father, who was quite scientific, he also brought some paraffin so that it may burn and the pain will go off. And when everything is over, it also talks about the cultural and the religious element when people say about the suffering and it was about the past and the coming life and all. But then finally, as I told you earlier, the mother who finally says, thank God, this scorpion left my child, fine, and bit me only, isn't it? So, the mother who is undergoing the pain and she is not aware of her own pain or not bothered by her own pain, but she is actually satisfied that it is good that the scorpion did not come upon my child. So, the poem is in a very narrative style. The poet's father, who is also skeptic, even though he may be considered to be pragmatic and rationalist, yet he does not do what is required, rather he applies that paraffin and all that. So, there is an ironic tone in the poem, and we can find such instances in other poems also. It is said about Nissim Ezekiel that since he was born in Mumbai and he considered Mumbai to be his own home, but then over the years he could find that Mumbai, which was only an island, and how over the years Mumbai became a metro, and it actually became a place for people from different areas, different localities, different faiths, different tastes, different habits, different professions, they gathered. And how suddenly this island, but still this island not only provides him a sort of belongingness, but the sort of chaos and the dividedness which is there, the poet is actually pained to see that, where he says that how he himself feels. Unsuitable for song as well as sense, the island flowers into slums and skyscrapers, the contraries. Life is full of contraries, my dear friend. On the one hand there are slums, on the other there are skyscrapers, reflecting precisely the growth of my mind. I am here to find my way in it. Sometimes I cry for help, but mostly keep my own counsel. No? As we live in a metro, we find that people are least bothered about what happens to others. They are so much soaked and confined in their own problems. So he actually talks about the problem of our city. I hear distorted echoes of my own ambiguous voice and of dragons claiming to be human. Bright and tempting bridges flow across the island, separating past from the future. Separating past from the future. See the beauty. Then the air is still again, as I sleep the fragrance of ignorance. How delight the soul with absolute sense of salvation. How hold to a single willed direction. I cannot leave the island. I was born here and belong. So here in the last one we find that the sense of alienation that he is developing, but then should he, because he had come to live here on an island in order to have a sort of silence, but now since it has grown and there are different sorts of chaos, different sort of dividedness, different sorts of conflicts, different sorts of problems, anxieties, and people are busy, people are head over heels in their business in order to get some space in this materialistic world, the poet feels himself quite a loner. But then what he says, I cannot leave the island. So a cry for identity, I cannot leave the island, I was born here and I belong. So the entire poem, if you read, even now a host of miracles hurries me a daily business, minding the ways of the island as a good native should, taking calm and clamor in my stride, but then I cannot leave this island. So even though now this island has been converted into a different place, should I leave it for silence, for isolation, for the peace of my mind, for tranquility? No. So we find that there is actually a sort of conflicting relationship between the native and the island. The person, I mean the poet, I mean especially he belongs to the Mumbai group of poets, and there were lots of competitions, but then and since he had also a sort of identity crisis that he feels and that he actually writes in majority of his poems. So and you know, in many of his poems, because Nissim Ezekiel is considered to be an urban poet, but the landscapes that he has delineated in his poems do not actually make him only an urban poet, because he has an eye for others as well. So there is actually a search for intellectual and spiritual order, because he is thinking of peace and all. And we can also find that there is the mayhem of the inner world, where the outside world is too busy, the inner world is in conflict. The inner world of the poet, the psyche of the poet is in conflict. Another poem which actually, again, it is here a search for love and it is a search for truth. It is a search for the poet's weapon, the poet's medium. This poem is titled Poet Lover Birdwatcher. If you read some of the lines which I'll mark, you will find actually what he tries to say here is that poetry is not such that simply through numerous efforts you can weave a poem. No, we are actually reminded of Keats also, who said that if poetry does not come to me naturally as leaves to a plant, it is better it should not come. And same is the condition with Nissim Ezekiel, who says, to force the pace and never to be still is not the way of those who study birds. Here he actually takes the reference of the bird and he has given it a title, poet, lover and bird watcher. All these people, all these three people, they have actually to wait, they have actually to watch, and when it has to come, it will come. It will come quite naturally, because he says, to force the pace and never to be still is not the way of those who study birds or women. The best poets wait for the words. I am underlining this word. The best poets wait for words. The hunt is not an exercise of will, but patient love relaxing on a hill. So, best poet will wait for a word, and unless that word come, he cannot write that poem. Until the one who knows that sees loved no longer waits but risks surrendering. In this the poet finds his moral proved, who never spoke before his spirit moved. So, if you simply think that you have to do something perforce, whether it is love, bird gazing, bird watching or writing poetry, no. The slow movement seems poetry is a way of life. It is a slow process. The slow movement seems somehow to say much more. To watch the rarer birds, you have to go along deserted lanes, and where the rivers flow in silence near the source or by a shore, remote and thorny like the heart's dark floor. And there the women slowly turn around, because he is talking about lover, beloved also, and so he says it is a slow process. Love, poetry writing and bird watching, and there the women slowly turn around, not only flesh and bone, but myths of light with darkness at the core and senses found, but poets lost in crooked restless flight. The deaf can hear, the blind recover sight. Now see the last line, the deaf can hear, the blind recover sight. So, when finally you have the inspiration, finally when that word has come, finally when that moment has come, the moment after lots of patient waiting has come, suddenly you will find that the sort of thing that you are going to say, it will become so powerful that even the deaf can hear and the blind can also get sight. I mean, poetry is also a penance, my dear friend. It is also a sort of waiting, and the best poets will wait for words. So, this is actually poet, lover, bird watcher. Now, when we have a look at, I mean, it is very difficult to talk about all the poems, but then I am simply trying to ignite a sort of passion to all my listeners and lovers of poetry, so that they can enter the world of Nissim Ezekiel and many other poets, contemporary poets, who are actually waiting to compose his own verses and weave them and serve them for people. So, finally, when we try to estimate Nissim Ezekiel as an Indian poet, because as he himself said that this is my background. There is a poem named Background also by Nissim Ezekiel, that is also very powerful, and you can have a look at it whenever time is fit for you to go through the entire corpus of Nissim Ezekiel. But here, when we sum up, we can find that there is actually, in the world of Nissim Ezekiel, there is a precision of diction and imagery. The poems may not be very long, my dear friend, and the words may not be very difficult. There is a sort of precision of both diction as well of imagery. He is not a poet who will actually be taken in by the colonialism, the provincialization of colonial empire or whatsoever. He does not write like colonial verse. He actually believes that he should write in tune with the times. Whatever is happening, whatever is changing, he must also respond to these changes. And that is why There is an disillusionment even in the wedding, even in the marriage, fine, and where he says, I too like a wedding guest, fine. Delineation of contemporary problems that you can also find in many of Nissim Ezekiel's poem. There are tones, and the tones are multiple. It is not the voice of the poet. Rather, the poet, through his own subtle lines and subtle imagery, tries to give the voice of the persona and tries to put the point of view. And what is of utmost importance in the poems of Nissim Ezekiel is that majority of his poems, they come to an end. It is a sort of rounding off with conclusion, and the conclusions are so subtle, and there is a lesson in it, my dear friend. So, whenever you happen to get some time, please explore the world of Nissim Ezekiel and try to find out the elements of modernity. And you can find that not only are there conflicts, not only are there barrennesses, not only are there emptiness, not only there are different voices, but not only there are different traditions, not only new challenges are raging their face, but then we are living, just like, to quote in the words of T.S. Eliot, where in one of his poems he says, son of a man, I can show you death in a handful of dust, fine. So, there are poems also which actually revolve around death in some of the poems of Nissim Ezekiel also. And then Eliot has also said, there is cry but no water, I mean talking about the contemporary problem, and today we are watching that, and we can find such such things having influenced the poets of the new India, that is independent India, and they cannot keep their doors shut to all these realities, my dear friend. So, before we sum up, let us quote one line from one of his collection which is entitled The Third, because the titles of his poems are also very symbolical. There is one title which is the exact name. I mean, it appears as if the poet is trying to find out his own identity. And here in this poem entitled Conclusion from the Third, what he says, you see, searching for the point of it, the meaning and the mood. The meaning and the mood, one learns over and over again the same thing. So, when you try to find for meaning, and when you try to find the meaning and the mood, one learns over and over again the same thing, that women, trees, tables, waves and birds, buildings, stones, steamrollers, cats and clocks are here to be enjoyed. What the poet actually tries to give the message is, you should not confine yourself or shut yourself off from the new realities that are emerging, whether it be the realities of the pleasures of the mind, the pleasures of the body, or the materialistic pleasures. You have to enjoy everything. Buildings, stones, steamrollers, fine. We are not in a world where we are talking simply about the rivers and the silences. We are also here to listen to the voices of the modern world, which actually comprises women, trees, tables, waves, birds, buildings, stones, steamrollers, cats and clocks. I mean, the world is going to be very commercial, very mechanical, but how long can you keep yourself away from all these? You have, so long as you have to be here on this earth, you have to enjoy, meaning thereby, if you simply say that you should remain ideal, no, materialism is also a part of life, and one cannot keep himself away from that. So, having said this, let me come to the end of today's lecture on specially early modern poets, and in the next lecture we shall again talk about and we shall discuss again one important modern poet. Till then, thank you very much. I wish you all a good life. Till then, keep searching for meaning, for moods, and for the point of your own views and experiences. Thank you very much.